will be recorded and posted to YouTube after. So we'll send out that link and it'll be available on social media and on our website. So thank you everyone for being here. This is a school funding update. You know, we're a bit through this legislative session, so we wanted to provide an update on, you know, what's happening around school funding. Happy Tuesday, February 22nd, 2022. My daughter's in 2nd grade, so she was very excited about Tuesday today. And so, you know, let's get right into it. We have a lot here. We are joined by Phil Sletten, Senior Policy Analyst at New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. We are very excited to have him here to talk about state revenues. So let's get right into it. And before we do, just a quick overview of Reaching Higher. So for network members, welcome to this meeting. For those who are new, Reaching Higher serves as a public policy resource for New Hampshire. All children deserve a high quality public education, and Reaching Higher provides people the tools and research that they need to make informed decisions to deliver on that promise. I am Christina Pretorius. I'm Reaching Higher New Hampshire's Policy Director. I'm joined today by our wonderful staff and by Phil from the Fiscal Policy Institute. So just a quick bit about the New Hampshire Education Network. Welcome to all of our network attendees and our guests. This network is an information sharing hub where we share goals of providing a high quality public education to all students in New Hampshire. We have monthly meetings on a range of topics. We have a listserv where members can connect and share resources regarding public education and things like that. And really our key guiding principles are listed here. High quality public education is responsive to needs of young people, families, and communities. It is equitable, it is student-centered, and it gives students the knowledge and skills to thrive. So this network really works as a group, as a community of people who are interested in advancing and protecting public education. If you'd like to register for the network, we can drop a link in the chat. And it includes access to the message board. It includes access to these monthly meetings and other communications that we have. So, you know, we have a lot to cover. Just a quick overview. We'll be talking about state revenues and what they mean for public schools. That will be guided by Phil. And then I will take over to recap school funding proposals in 2022 and House Bill 1671, which was introduced last week. Just a quick note, if you have questions, please drop them into the question and answer box. We will get to them. For the school funding related ones, they will be after the entire presentation. But if you have questions as Phil presents on revenues, drop them in and he'll take them right after his section. So drop them in, we're anxious to hear them. And also, you know, if there are any other topics that you'd like to hear, we do these monthly. So if you have any ideas for topics or something you'd like to learn more on, please drop it into either the chat or the Q&A and we'll read them and take them into consideration. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Phil.
All right, thank you very much, Christina. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon. Again, my name is Phil Sletten. I'm a senior policy analyst at the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. NHFPI is a nonprofit independent policy research organization based in Concord. We examine the state budget and state revenue policy, the state economy, and the economic security of Granite Staters with a particular eye towards those with low and moderate incomes in the state. So I want to talk to you a little bit about where we are with state revenues now, where we ended up last fiscal year, state fiscal year 2021, which ended back at the end of June of 2021, but we have sort of the final numbers now, so we'll look back at that a little bit too, and what some of the projections that we have at this point say going forward, and what that all means for the state's education trust fund. Christina, if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the big picture of the state's operating budget, and the state's operating budget is divided up into funds, and think of funds as sort of accounts. Money flows in from various sources and goes out for various purposes. This is a big picture at this point. There's a lot that, for example, is in the other funds slice. There's a lot that's in the federal funds slice. It's worth remembering that about 30% of the state's operating budget is funded by federal transfers, and this isn't including some federal funds that are accepted later. This is not anything special in terms of the amount of funding that came from the American Rescue Plan Act or from the CARES Act in 2020. This 30% is about what it is for New Hampshire relatively consistently. Now, you can see there are other funds here, but the two that I want to draw your attention to are the ones that are on the right side of your screen. The general fund in green, which is about a quarter of the budget, and the education trust fund in orange. So we'll focus on those two slices for essentially the rest of the presentation. Christina, if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So what you see here in this pie chart is the revenues for those two slices, the general and education trust fund slices that were in the last pie. And these are combined, right? And a lot of these revenue sources are actually shared. A portion of a revenue source will support the general fund, and a portion of that same revenue source will support the education trust fund. So usually these two funds, the revenues for these two funds are looked at together. Not all revenue sources are shared, some are specific to one or another, but many of them, especially the large ones, are split. And you'll see here that the state's, the general education trust funds is a relatively diverse revenue picture. There are only 4 sources that are above 10% of the pie. That's not to say that, for example, the lottery commission profits, liquor commission profits, insurance premium tax, interest and dividends tax are insignificant. They're very significant parts of the pie, but there aren't really 1 or 2 dominant sources. The exception to that might be, for example, the 2 business taxes combined. The business profits tax and the business enterprise tax are separate and distinct tax revenue sources. I have shaded them together on this pie chart because they're often analyzed together. They're usually filed together. Entities that are paying both will provide quarterly estimate payments together without parsing through what is happening with the business profits tax and what is happening with their business enterprise tax liability. So they're often analyzed together. However, they are very different tax revenue sources. So the business profits tax is more like your typical corporate income tax, and business profits are the tax base. The business enterprise tax is based more on compensation, interest, and dividends paid by or accrued in some cases. So that is more of a tax on wages paid by businesses. So they're very different taxes, but they're often filed together and analyzed together. You can see the next largest slice of the pie is the statewide education property tax, which is raised and retained locally. So the state accounts for those dollars when it's paying for its statutory requirements for the adequate education grants, but the state never actually collects that money. It is all raised locally and retained locally. So it's technically a state tax, but it functions much more like a local property tax would. The meals and rentals tax is the next largest source, and then you can see the remainder provide the balance. If you could go to the next slide, please, Christina. All right, so this is looking at just the revenue sources for the education trust fund. So same revenue, some of the same revenue sources that we saw in the last pie chart, but their education trust fund revenue is broken out here. You can see that the whole statewide education property tax goes to the education trust fund. And then the business enterprise tax is actually the next largest portion, close to $250 million in state fiscal year 2021 went from the business enterprise tax to support the education trust fund. And then profits from the lottery commission and then the business profits tax were the next largest pieces, as well as portions of the tobacco tax, the real estate transfer tax, the meals and rentals tax, the whole utility property tax, and the first $40 million of tobacco settlement payments. Those are your contributors to the education trust fund. If you could go to the next slide, please, Christina. Thank you. So looking at the last 2 state fiscal, or the current state fiscal year and where the last one ended, one of the things that's noteworthy is that when we're talking about the general and education trust funds combined, which is where most, but not all, tax revenue that the state collects flows to, the state actually saw significant surpluses. State fiscal year 2020, there was a deficit at the end of the year, but state fiscal year 2021, there was a surplus of, as you can see on this graph, more than $300 million in terms of the revenue surplus at the end of the year. Now, most of that went to the rainy day fund. The rainy day fund's balance is close to $250 million now, so close to about $240, $250 million. But that surplus was generated in large part by a surplus in business tax revenue. So you can see in orange, the combined business tax revenue surplus. And the real estate transfer tax and the lottery commission profits also were significant contributors to those. And some others contributed more actually in this fiscal year thus far, July through January, than in last fiscal year. But you can see, even if you look at this most recent year, the business tax receipts have been quite a bit higher than were expected by state budgeters. And remember, state fiscal year 2021, that was the last budget. State fiscal year 2022 is the first year of this budget. So we're looking at both pre-pandemic budget projections in state fiscal year 21 and then pandemic era, if you will, budget projections for state fiscal year 22, both of which are being outpaced by recent revenues. So the state has some significant revenue surpluses in the general and education trust funds combined. If you go to the next slide, please, Christina. Thank you. So the State Department of Administrative Services did just earlier this month publish some revenue projections for what total revenues to the general and education trust funds will look like over time. You can see, and I'll point to the thinner green line first, and this graph is in billions of dollars. You can see from 2.4 to $3 billion over on the left side of your screen. The thin green line is what the state budget planned in terms of revenue for these funds. That is part of the state budget process. The legislature projects what revenues are going to come in over the next 2 years. So anything above that line is a revenue surplus because the state's the revenues are exceeding what was planned in the state budget. And you can see, and that happens in sort of 2-year chunks because we have a biennial budget. So 2020 and 2021, for example, was the last budget. 2022 and 23 are this budget's projections. You can see the actual revenues that came in that thick blue line. So from 2019 to 2020, we saw a drop in revenues, in large part because of the pandemic. And then in 2021, quite an increase in the revenues that came into the general and education trust funds. Now, if you look at the dashed orange line, those revenue projections, they actually go down, suggesting that 2021 would be a peak revenue year, or at least a local peak revenue year, and that revenues are expected to go down. Some of that may have to do with economic activity that may be more one-time or temporary. Some of it is also because of the planned tax reductions and reductions in tax rates in the business profits and business enterprise tax, the one-time reduction in the statewide education property tax, the permanent reduction in the meals and rentals tax, and the phase out of the interest and dividends tax. Those are all reducing revenue in the future. Again, looking at these projections that the state agencies have put together. The next slide, please, Christina. Thank you. Now, I've noted at a couple instances here that business tax revenue has done quite well. Part of that is the lion's share, certainly not all of it, but a significant portion of business tax revenue is driven by the business profits tax. It's the single largest tax revenue source the state has. And remember that a business doesn't have to be based in New Hampshire to have taxable profits under the business profits tax in New Hampshire. It has to have operations, right? It has to be active, depending on which year you're looking at. It has to be selling things in the state, or it has to have property or personnel in the state. But the profits that are generated, sort of and attributed to the state are taxable even if the business isn't based here. So indeed, for the business profits tax, large multi-state and multinational entities are a significant portion of the business profits tax base. So this graph shows US corporate profits on a quarterly basis. And you can see for the second quarter of 2020, there was a pretty significant drop, again, associated with that sort of initial wave of the pandemic. But since then, there's been a very significant rise. And those higher profits, those higher corporate profits, are likely a significant contributor to what we've seen in revenue upswing in at least our business taxes in New Hampshire at this point in terms of the revenue collected. Next slide, please, Christina. Thank you. So what does this all mean for the Education Trust Fund? The picture for just the Education Trust Fund, as you saw between those two different pie charts, the general fund collects revenue from some other sources as well beyond what the Education Trust Fund, beyond the ones that go to the Education Trust Fund. And the Education Trust Fund's been affected a little bit differently than the total picture, although not dramatically so. One thing to remember is the splits between the business profits tax and the business enterprise tax. These taxes are filed together, then split apart after they're filed and after the Department of Revenue Administration sort of sorts through them. And they also have different splits in terms of what contributes to the general fund and what contributes to the Education Trust Fund. So as you saw on those pie charts, most of the business enterprise tax revenue supports the Education Trust Fund, although a small portion goes to the general fund. The business profits tax, which is the larger tax and generally the more volatile one, is the opposite. Most goes to support the general fund, while some goes to support the Education Trust Fund. And to the extent the revenue increases that we've seen recently are driven more by profits than by an increase in the enterprise tax base, which remember is based on compensation, so wages that businesses pay, then we may expect that some more of those revenues are actually going to the general fund as opposed to the Education Trust Fund. Both are still in very favorable territory at this point, but it's important to remember when we're thinking about surpluses that the Education Trust Fund surplus may look a little bit different than the total picture. Now, as of the end of December, we did receive a little bit more information from the Office of Legislative Budget Assistant on the Education Trust Fund in particular. It's important to remember that the Education Trust Fund does carry forward any surplus. So if it has a surplus at the end of the year, it doesn't send the surplus back to the general fund, for example. It retains that surplus and carries it forward. And if it faces a shortfall relative to its obligations, any balance in the general fund is used to offset that shortfall. So those are two significant things to remember when we're talking about the bigger picture here. The general fund may have a deficit at the end, but the general fund will fill any deficit in the Education Trust Fund. But as of the end of December, the Education Trust Fund had a surplus of about $40.6 million. Again, these are estimates based on the information known about the parsing available and some historical trends between these tax revenue sources. And that's obviously a significant surplus. However, about 6 months prior, state budget writers had projected a surplus of about $54.4 million for the end of December 2021. So the Education Trust Fund was a little bit behind where it was expected to be at that point. Still a surplus, still positive territory. Revenues obviously played a role in that, but there were two primary reasons for that shortfall relative to expectations identified by the Office of Legislative Budget Assistant. One was an additional approximately $8 million draw from the Education Freedom Account costs that were not projected during the budget process. And another is about $2.4 million in additional adequate education aid over what was budgeted because student enrollment projections were actually a little bit off, they were a little bit low. And an additional $2.4 million was needed actually when the actual enrollment levels were learned. So those affected that Education Trust Fund balance as well. If you could go to the next slide, please, Christina. Thank you. And of course, these data are a little bit older, and I know that many folks on this in this event who are listening here may know this much better than I do, but it's important to remember that local public school district revenue is primarily produced by local property taxes. Obviously not entirely, but if you look at these data, and these again data are a little bit older, but from 2019 to 2020, local taxation, so again local property taxes essentially, contributed about 62% of all reported school district revenue, and the statewide education property tax was about another 11%. So about 73%, or a little north of 70% anyway, were generated by property taxes that were raised and retained locally. You can see the blue slices are other state aid and other state aid that came directly from the state, as opposed to the statewide education property tax being the state requiring it to be raised and retained locally. And then that orange slice of federal sources, about 5%. That matches what we had seen in prior years. I imagine if you were to look at more recent data, that federal slice would grow following some of the pandemic-related legislation. If we could go to the next slide, please, Christina. Thank you. So some quick summary points. the state's really in very good financial shape overall in terms of the resources that it has available, particularly when including the rainy day fund balance, which again is about $250 million, and the federal funds, particularly the flexible federal funds available from the American Rescue Plan Act. Overall, the state has a significant amount of resources. It's worth noting, however, that future revenues may not be as high as what we saw in state fiscal year 2021. That's what the projections are suggesting. That's in part due to reduced tax rates in future years. The state will be collecting less revenue because of those tax reductions. And the education trust fund surplus was smaller than was expected at the end of December 2021, but it's still a surplus, and the education trust fund can rely on general fund support if needed at the end of each year. If the general fund needs support, then it can also rely in turn on the rainy day fund at the end of each budget biennium. And the state has significant resources available, these and other resources, to help create a more equitable and inclusive educational opportunities for everyone in the state. So thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any that are specific to this presentation. If not, I can stick around till the end if there are questions that are generated by it.
Thanks so much, Phil. So if anyone has any questions, please drop them in the Q&A. I'm just checking right now. I don't see any yet, but I have a question, if that's all right.
Yes.
How often do lawmakers sort of take a pulse on revenues where they stand? Is it like a quarterly thing, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So during the budget process, so during odd numbered years, like last year and next year, right? What happens is there are several sets of revenue projections. The budget process starts with the state agencies. The state agencies will develop sort of internal revenue projections. Those will inform their, and the governor's office will also work with them to develop internal revenue projections. Those will inform the budgets that they then submit to the governor. And those are in even numbered years, I should say. The governor then starts working on the state budget after in the late portion of an even numbered year. So, for example, in late 2020, the governor started working on the 2021 budget proposal, which was for the next two state fiscal years after that. So the governor then produces revenue projections in this case, his state budget proposal. And that is usually released in February, again, of odd numbered years. The legislature, however, starts looking at it and thinking about it relatively early. So the House Ways and Means Committee in particular will start thinking about revenue projections before they see the governor's proposal. And they will then produce their own set of revenue projections for the House budget proposal. The Senate will then produce its set of revenue projections for the Senate budget proposal. And the Committee of Conference, there'll be sort of a final set of projections produced if that budget ends up being the one that passes. So during the budget process, there's actually sort of 5 different sets of groups that will come together and over the course of a year look at revenue in a relatively rapid succession. During non-budget years, then it is much more up to the discretion of the legislative committees. So the House Ways and Means Committee does typically produce another set of revenue estimates in even numbered years, like 2022, like we're in now. That doesn't mean that they have to. There's not a requirement for them to do so, but they typically do, or they often do, I should say. The Senate Ways and Means Committee is a little less likely to do that, but they will sometimes work with the House Ways and Means Committee, for example, and there's nothing that stops them from doing it. The revenue projections that you saw in this presentation are a requirement under state law that the legislature requires the Department of Administrative Services to provide a revenue estimate update at the beginning of even numbered years. So basically at the beginning of a non-budget year. And that gives the legislature some insight into how much revenue, how many resources might be available above and beyond the state budget. So if they were to, for example, appropriate more resources in a non-state budget year through separate pieces of legislation, these revenue projections and whatever work, for example, the House Ways and Means Committee may do could inform those. Or if there is a deficit, right, it allows them to respond potentially. So there is that formal check-in. But there is nothing as comprehensive as sort of a quarterly update to your question, Christina. There used to be an entity called the Governor's Consensus Revenue Estimating Panel. That met, I believe that met a little bit more frequently, but that entity has not existed for some time at this point, or not functioned in its former fashion for some time.
Okay, thank you so much for that. We do have another question. If there is a surplus in the Education Trust Fund, might the budget writers provided a smaller share of the revenue pie in the next budget?
If there's a surplus in the Education Trust Fund, then budget writers have in the past used that surplus to fund education-related expenses in subsequent budget years. So those dollars being carried forward means that if there's a certain amount of obligations or a certain amount of expenditures that the legislature plans on the state budget to cover that are drawing from the Education Trust Fund, then those surplus dollars would be drawn from, as opposed to freshly generated revenue, if you will. So I think the answer to your question, if I'm understanding it correctly, is yes. That being said, there's nothing that stops the legislature, and indeed the legislature has in the relatively recent past maintained a surplus in the Education Trust Fund. It's just a question of how much they're drawing from it. In this budget and in the last budget, there were some either one-time or sort of temporarily drawn from other revenue sources expenditures related to education. And also the legislature has relatively recently shifted some education-related costs that were drawing from the general fund to drawing from the Education Trust Fund. So for example, school building aid used to be a general fund funded expenditure, and they've shifted it recently to be an Education Trust Fund funded expenditure. Part of that is the Education Trust Fund used to run a deficit regularly, and the general fund would have to provide the balance. That does not happen as regularly, likely as a combination of both relatively favorable revenues in the recovery from the Great Recession, so the second half of the last decade, and the declining student populations. So the Education Trust Fund's fundamental funding structure didn't change, while there were more revenues being generated and fewer students to draw on the adequate education grants. There was also, a reduction in stabilization aid for several years, and that reduced the funding that was coming out of the Education Trust Fund and generated more opportunity for surpluses.
Great, thank you for that. We have one more question, and then we're going to shift gears, and then maybe we can have a little bit of time at the end for some more question and answers. So was the smaller $2.4 million in adequate education aid due to smaller enrollment related in any way to education freedom accounts? And I can maybe take that if you, okay. So I think I might have misunderstood. The $2.4 million, the adequate education aid was $2.4 million over projection. Is that right?
Yes, my understanding,
okay.
It was $2.4 million of added costs that were not projected by the state budget.
Okay, and I just to get quickly to this education freedom account, the school voucher, we saw that $8.1 million draw from the Education Trust Fund was because a lot of there was a much higher than enrollment than expected in that EFA program, and a lot of those students had already been enrolled in private schools or homeschools, and so there wasn't a whole lot of. We won't see that enrollment dip, that effect on public school adequacy grants until next year, based on the way that schools are funded. They're funded from the previous year, so next year we'll see that drop, and it's about 200 students this year who switched, according to the department. 200 students switched from public schools to EFA program, and so we'll see that with the next year's adequacy payments. So, all right. Well, thanks so much, Phil. And if you wouldn't mind sticking around, we might have some more questions at the end for you.
Absolutely, I'm happy to stick around.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And so we are going to switch gears a little bit to school funding this year in 2022. All All right, to set the scene, we wanted to take a quick minute to talk through, before we get into legislative proposals, what lawmakers had done in the past, what they're thinking of doing, what the future of school funding looks like, really set the scene in what effective school funding formulas look like. Here at Reaching Higher, we have spent years combing through data, research, presentations, committee meetings, the whole gamut on how can we support our students and how can we give schools the resources they need to meet the needs of each and every student. And we really found the best summation from EdBuild, which was a nonprofit who unfortunately closed in 2020, but this organization was solely focused on studying school funding formulas nationwide. And they found that effective school funding systems share these 4 key pillars. They are adequate and sufficient to support a rigorous, high-quality education. They are equitable in that funding is targeted based on student need with the goal of closing opportunity gaps. They hold leaders responsible and give them the resources that they need, but also trust them to use them in ways that work best for their communities. And they're transparent in that they hold schools, state administrators, and legislators accountable for providing appropriate resources. And so, there are a number of states who are going through similar discussions around their own school funding formulas, what they look like, and things like that. And so I found this quote from a researcher from UC Berkeley to be really powerful when we're thinking about school funding. And he had testified last month in a school funding case in Pennsylvania that in order for funds to be effective, they have to be predictable, recurring, and sustained, which allows districts to make long-range investments in their schools. And I think this really struck us at Reaching Higher because school funding in New Hampshire has gone through so many changes in the past, from targeted aid programs phasing in and out, changes in adequacy, everything that's happened with stabilization grants and all that. So when thinking about equitable school resourcing here in New Hampshire, this was really critical and this really struck us. So we wanted to just really quickly share it. So let's look at school funding, where school funding stands right now. We really are at a critical juncture. It feels like we say this, every year, but the state has really had to defend its public school funding system for going on 3 decades now, with the latest lawsuit in the state Supreme Court. That's the Conval lawsuit that we've been following for the past couple of years. In 2019, lawmakers created about $60 million worth of targeted aid and set up a year-long commission to study school funding. That was literally it was called the Commission to Study School Funding, and it wrapped up its research and work in December 2020. But in this legislative biennium, we saw with last year's state budget that lawmakers cut public school funding by $25 million, allowed those targeted aid funds to lapse, and replaced them with a $100 million tax cut and a $17 million swept relief fund. And those actions really disproportionately benefited towns with larger property tax bases. They did institute a $17.5 million relief fund for districts based on the number of students navigating poverty. So we see that in effect right now, that schools have been receiving that, and that will be ongoing. It is not set to expire or lapse unless lawmakers decide to do that. But really, our analyses showed that all else being equal, replacing these targeted aid programs with the tax cut and with this $17.5 million relief fund would really lead to higher local tax rates in places like Northumberland, in Berlin, in Claremont, in Derry, but would decrease local property taxes in places like Bolton Borough, Rye, and Holderness. So, when we think about what lawmakers have done with this state budget and how that affects school funding and how that affects communities, there are a lot of open questions when it comes to equitable resourcing and things like that. And so, at the same time, schools are expected to receive about $37 million fewer dollars in 2023, which is next school year, than this year in 2022. This is really largely due to enrollment hold harmless provisions that will be expiring at the end of this year. So between 2020 and 2021, the state's public schools saw a drop of about 4%, but lawmakers held that enrollment related funding steady through this school year. So we can see here, base adequacy. This year, schools received about $634 million. Next year, once that hold harmless lapses, they'll get about $603 million, despite having about the same number of students. It did decline slightly by about 1,000 students, but really, when you're talking about 160,000 students, that's a pretty big drop for a relatively small decline in student population. So here we see the impact of those enrollment fluctuations. And so these counts are from the New Hampshire Department of Education. The blue line is what student enrollment has done. And then the orange line is what the state has funded them at. So this is the pandemic year. So lawmakers last year recognized, we're seeing this big drop in enrollment. School funding is going to dip quite a bit at a time that's probably not the best, because schools are dealing with a lot in terms of meeting student needs through the pandemic and everything like that. And so they instituted a hold harmless. So districts were able to use enrollment counts from pre-pandemic to calculate school funding. Those calculations, that hold harmless provision is lapsing. And so now we see that there will be a drop of about $30 million in adequacy aid in come 2023. And so, these enrollment dips, they really aren't a uniquely New Hampshire phenomenon. States across the nation have seen this. States have seen student populations bounce back. Some like New Hampshire have seen it remain pretty steady. So we dropped about 4% of enrollment, and we've sort of held that enrollment constant for next year. So, unlike other states, a lot of states have this dip, but unlike some other states, that phenomenon is really accelerated by our demographic shifts. So every year there's about a 1% dip in the number of students in public schools in New Hampshire. And that's really due to our aging population. And there are really a host of factors that are really impacting our state's ability to retain and attract younger residents. There are a lot of conversations around the state on why that is, and we certainly won't go into them, but it does impact student enrollment in our public schools. So, with $35 million fewer adequacy dollars, what are lawmakers proposing this year? And really, we see three key proposals. SB 420, which creates an extraordinary need grant for schools with lower property tax bases that provides about $25 million over the biennium. So it's not just per year, it is over the 2 years combined. And that provides grants of up to $650 per eligible student. Those go to students that are eligible for school meal programs, that free or reduced lunch program, on a sliding scale. And that really depends on the town's property tax base. So those with the lowest property tax bases get the largest grants, and then it sort of slides down from there. The Senate did pass that bill. I believe it was last week, and so now it is headed to Senate Finance. A public hearing for that has not yet been scheduled, but we're watching out for that as well. Senate Bill 426 is a hold harmless bill for student enrollment fluctuations. It would preserve that $30 million in lost state funding due to the enrollment. It actually isn't a dip because enrollment has stayed steady since last year, but it continues that hold harmless and preserves that funding. Districts would be able to use the highest enrollment count from pre-pandemic to now in order to calculate funding. It is coming out of Senate Education with an ITL recommendation, a recommendation to kill it. And it is going to the Senate floor on Thursday. So we'll see the real fate of that. There isn't a similar bill in the House that we have seen. So this is really the one bite at the apple. So if it dies, then that conversation is on hold for now. And so we'll see where that goes from there. And then House Bill 1680 really proposes a whole new school funding formula. This is the result of the work of the Commission to Study School Funding in 2020. So it creates an outcomes-based funding model. According to New Hampshire Department of Education estimates, it would infuse the state with about $107 million more in fiscal year 2024 when it would be implemented. It's a phase-in grant, meaning it would take a couple of years to phase in, but once it does infuse a lot more money, and it focuses those resources on districts in order to reduce opportunity gaps. So it takes into account, student test scores, graduation rates, sizes of schools, the grades that are offered, and really targets state funds with the goal of reducing opportunity gaps and providing schools the resources that they need to really meet the needs of their students. And so that bill was sent to interim study. It will be the focus of a summer work group. We've heard from Chairman Ladd, the chairman of the House Education Committee, that they'll also be looking at a couple of other things through the summer. There was a work group that looked at how the state measures poverty, measures student need. The state currently really relies on federal free and reduced lunch numbers, but since the pandemic and everything that's happened with that, the state is really starting to rethink, how can we best measure student need and where should we go from here? So we're expecting some work around that as well. But that summer work group for HB 1680 will probably look at a number of other things. So we'll be watching that one pretty closely. So, what does this all mean? When we think about the future of school funding in New Hampshire, what does it look like? And this is a bit of a different tone than looking at specific bills and thinking about, conversations of fiscal notes and that kind of thing. But it's still really, really important. Contrary to what we went over at the top of this school funding section, we're really seeing a marked shift in the tone around our public schools. And this is not unique to New Hampshire. Anyone who's been following education news, education policy can see that there's this really national movement in terms of really effectively dismantling public education and really chipping away at the promise of public education, really as we know it. And we're seeing it here in New Hampshire, in our state houses, at our school board meetings, really in our communities. Our school funding system has been one of the most regressive in the country for years now. School funding debates in the past have largely focused around taxes. How will we raise the money? How much should we raise? What should we be paying per student? How can we send those resources to districts that most need it? Really, that question of how do we fund our public schools? How are we going to raise the money? How should we spend it? That kind of thing. But we're seeing a really challenging change and shift in the conversation to really, should we fund our public schools? And we're seeing that from a lot of proposals last year, this year, around privatization efforts, a slate of bills that undermine trust in our systems, in our educators, in our administrators, in our school boards. So we're really seeing this play out in real time. And so one of the bigger ways that we're seeing this play out is through House Bill 1671, which was introduced to the House Education Committee last week. This bill would overhaul the laws around what constitutes a public education in New Hampshire, most notably by cutting core content domains down to 4: math, English, science, and social studies. It removes subjects from those core knowledge domains. It removes art, health, world languages, PE, and a number of others from those core domains. And so, you might be asking yourself, well, what does this have to do with school funding? What's happening here? Our school funding system, I think, for those of you who have listened to our Claremont podcast or who have read some of our other content, our funding system is an inputs-based system. So when the formula was designed, lawmakers came together and said, we want schools to offer X, Y, and Z. And we think it will cost this much for teachers, administrators, materials, all of that jazz. And then they divide that by a student count to get that per student funding amount, which is about $3,700 per student. And so cutting those programs, that X, Y, and Z that they think that they should be paying for, cutting those programs could move the state to a place where they're sort of backing away their financial responsibility to schools and to communities. And, New Hampshire Department of Education Commissioner Frank Edelblut testified in support of this bill last week. He introduced the bill and the thinking behind it, and sort of why he felt how he felt. And he said that he was asked, can schools cut programs? Can they cut art? Can they cut health if they don't have the budget for it? And he essentially said, yeah, like they could outsource those courses by recommending students take them through VLAX. They could mold them into the 4 content areas. But he left this really big question of, do schools only have to offer those 4 subjects? Is that really, like, are we going to that in that direction? And he himself did say, it's a bold approach. We at Reaching Higher are still working through a lot of the specifics of the bill, and we'll offer more content, more insight into it and its effects, in the coming weeks. We're out on break next week, but we will be back, and this will be a big focus for us in really parsing out what are the changes that are being proposed and what are the effects that this could come out, that could come of this. And there hasn't been an executive session on the bill yet. So we really are keeping our ear to the ground, but we did hear from the committee that they've been receiving a lot of emails after the public hearing. A lot of people are really concerned about this bill, and if it doesn't pass, really, what does it mean for the future of public ed? What does it mean for these conversations? And so, we're listening, and we're going to keep working and trying to figure out, what does this mean for public ed? And so, just to wrap up before we get to the Q&A section, we wanted to give people a quick idea of where we're at this session. So crossover day, when all of the House bills go to the Senate and all of the Senate bills go to the House if they haven't already, is March 31st. So we know that the House and Senate are really quickly moving through all of their remaining bills. The Senate Education Committee has worked through all of their early bills already. They're not meeting next week. They've already had public hearings. The House has had public hearings on most of their bills, and they're holding marathon executive sessions. They had one today. They have them scheduled for the rest of the week. They have next week off, and then they'll be right back at it the week after to really go through the remaining bills. And so we're watching. They're very busy, and we'll give people updates sort of as they come. And so with that, we can take some questions. And it looks like we don't have any yet, but if you have any, please feel free to drop them either in the Q&A or the chat, really either one. And we'll just wait a couple of more, a minute more, and then if there aren't any, then hey, we're out early, and it's good stuff. Give everyone their afternoon back. All right, and somebody asks, is there any interest in limiting the amount of money allocated to school vouchers? There was a bill that was proposed. I'm sorry, I forget the number right off the top of my head. There was some public testimony on it. It was in the House Education Committee. They haven't had an executive session yet, so no, I don't know, how that's going to go, which direction that's going to go. I would guess that it would probably be acted upon sometime this week, but we'll see for sure. But that bill does limit the the amount that's spent on school vouchers to the budgeted amount. So next year, the New Hampshire Department of Education fiscal impact statement budgeted, I believe it was somewhere around $1.6 million. So the scholarship organization would only be able to award $1.6 million in EFAs. We'll see, there's no executive session on it. I will say that all of the voucher bills in the Senate so far, in the Senate Education Committee, the members had said that, they're not comfortable with changing the school voucher program yet. because there's that legislative oversight committee of the program, and they really want to wait to see what that oversight committee says. So whether or not really any voucher bills related to the school voucher program will pass, it's really unclear, but we'll be watching for sure. Oh, and I got the 3 bills, so let me just put that back up for people. So these are the 3 school funding bills, SB 420, which had passed, SB 426, which is coming out with an ITL recommendation, and then House Bill 1680, which is in, will be referred to a study committee. All right, so we have, is 1671 an attempt to lower adequacy? That is really to be seen. There wasn't a whole lot of conversation around HB 1671's impact on school funding at the public hearing, but we are hearing a lot of concern that this is a secondary effect of a bill like 1671. That, you know, if the state is already talking about how we fund our public schools, what that amount should be, you know, what does a bill like 1671 add to that discussion? How does it change it? So that's something that we'll be watching really closely. Oh, and Representative Cahill says that the bill limiting EFAs was defeated in the House session last week. And now that you say that, I think you're right, it was. So that bill was killed. It won't go any further. All right, and with that, I would like to thank everyone for coming here today. Again, this will be recorded. It will be posted on YouTube. Thank you so much to Phil for being a part of this and for coming and talking about state revenues. We so appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Happy to come talk about revenues anytime.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, thanks everyone. And I'll leave my email up in case anyone wants to email, contact, you know, chat about education issues. Feel free. Thanks everyone.